Robby, what's on your radar?
Well, we know that the Twitter files have exposed the federal government's efforts to compel a private company, Twitter, to censor speech that was disfavored by the national intelligence agencies, national health experts, and elites in the mainstream media. Despite the protections of the First Amendment, which provides that the government may not stop people from speaking, various government actors have worked tirelessly to silence speech for years, taking special aim at so-called misinformation related to elections, Hunter Biden, COVID, and more. Now, thanks to efforts by Matt Taibbi, Michael Schellenberger, Barry Weiss, Lee Fang, and of course Twitter's new CEO himself, Elon Musk, we have now seen behind the curtain. We have seen so many emails from would-be censors in government reaching out to Twitter, politely suggesting that this account is Russian in origin and up to no good, that this other account is wrong about the COVID vaccines and it's going viral and that's a danger, that this joke about what day the election takes place on, well, that could be misinterpreted by a gullible person. The government would love if Twitter would do something to fix this. Government bureaucrats know they can't make Twitter do it, but they can complain. Then they can leak the situation to their friends in the mainstream media who'll write negative stories about Twitter, and they can make sure those stories provide ammunition for Democratic legislators who just so happen to be looking at new regulations that could hurt Twitter's bottom line. Continuing dispatches from the Twitter files have actually undermined an early impression formed by so many people, myself included, about content moderators at Twitter, namely Yoel Roth, former head of Twitter Trust and Safety. Roth was initially portrayed as a villain in all this for taking part in some admittedly bad content moderation calls, including the decision to restrict the Hunter Biden laptop story under a hacked materials justification. Very bad. But after reading all those emails from law enforcement, national intelligence, health advisors, it's clear that Roth actually did put up some resistance, and as did his colleagues. Their resolve was simply worn down over time by the tone of the government's messages. The government was insistent that Twitter was besieged by evil Russian influence, that Twitter's failure to control COVID misinformation was going to get millions killed, that the mainstream media and Democratic lawmakers would work in tandem to gut Twitter if the platform failed to take action against such pressure. It's really not surprising that government bureaucrats eventually got their way, and in the future, opponents of big tech censorship need to focus more on the big government side of all of this. To that end, new evidence is emerging that shows, unsurprisingly, that Twitter was not the only target of the U.S. government, which is unsurprising, as part of a lawsuit against the Biden administration for pressuring social media companies to take down contrarian COVID speech. Missouri's Attorney General obtained this email sent by a White House staffer to Facebook moderators. It reads, the top post about vaccines today is Tucker Carlson saying they don't work. Yesterday was Tomi Lahren saying she won't take one. This is exactly why I want to know what reduction looks like. If reduction means pumping our most vaccine-hesitant audience with Tucker Carlson saying it doesn't work, then I'm not sure it's reduction. A White House staffer also flagged specific contrarian Facebook posts for deletion. The White House was obsessed with what kinds of opinions were being offered, not just on Twitter, but obviously on Facebook as well. They don't think whether the vaccines work is a subject one could hold a variety of views on, even though it's certainly true that the vaccines work to differing degrees depending on what we're talking about. Are we talking about severe disease and death, or are we talking about simply the COVID spread? And it matters a little bit whether we're talking about vulnerable people or whether we're talking about young people. None of these distinctions mattered to the career bureaucrats who were in conversation every single day with content moderators at all the major speech platforms. Stay tuned for a big investigation that I've been working on this subject. That'll be coming later this month. But in the meantime, I want to talk more about, what we've seen from these emails, Batya, the Twitter files, and then this email showing that, well, of course, it was happening with Facebook as well. Tucker Carlson, Tomi Lahren, to Tucker's a Fox News person. Tomi has, I think, she's also part of Fox, I think on the Fox Nation platform and some other places. Outkick, yeah. Two people, conservative voices who were raising questions about the efficacy of the vaccines. I'm sure they've said things about COVID and about the vaccines that I personally don't agree with, that I don't think are supported by the evidence, as has basically everyone who's ever offered an opinion on this thing, given that the reality is ever changing, including what the elites and the health experts said is now vastly different. What's true is vastly different than what they said in the first place. So it seems pretty egregious and baffling to me that the White House would spend significant time, like, don't they have better things to do? Just emailing Twitter and Facebook all day saying, hey, can you take this down? Hey, this isn't exactly right. Hey, we're really worried about this. Like, what's your problem?
Yeah, so a number of questions come to mind for me. The first is there a difference for you in how they handled the Hunter Biden laptop story and how they handled COVID? To me, the difference there is very much a difference of intention. Like with COVID, you could say, I don't think it was right what they did in either case. But you could argue with COVID that they were trying to save lives, that they felt that people not taking the vaccine was going to put them in danger, right? But with Hunter Biden, it was like clearly just their political adversaries. They really, really, really didn't want Trump to win, right? So that's the first question I have. Is there a moral difference and a legal difference between those two things from your point of view? The second question I have is the one I've had from the beginning, which is, if law enforcement asks you to do something wrong, right? What level of freedom of speech do you still have in making that decision? What level of authority and autonomy did Yoel Roth have here? At what point does it become coercion? And are you convinced that that threshold has been met? And of course, the third question would be, how are we supposed to judge this going forward as a nation? The church committee that was one of these conditions that McCarthy has agreed to in order to convince the holdouts to vote for him as speaker. Do you think that that is going to address these larger questions? So those are my three questions for you.
I do think the threshold has been reached. I mean, I think it's a matter for debate. It's in my opinion, it's been reached. I think between the pressure, the constant pressuring from so many different government agencies, and then at the same time, there's going to be a regulatory push, and then people in the Biden White House raising the prospect of doing regulation if they don't get enough compliance from social media companies. That seems to me to be, now we're on the other side of the First Amendment. I could be wrong. I think that's something a court should take up. That is something a court is going to take up given this lawsuit from Missouri and other states. Your first question is very interesting, and this is something I've tried to engage with at least. Is there a difference between the pressuring on COVID speech and the pressuring on Hunter Biden? I could actually see it the other way from you, and you're kind of suggesting that the Hunter Biden stuff is just so nakedly political, where there's like a compared to the COVID stuff, well, they might have been wrong and maybe they shouldn't have done it, but their intentions were more benign. I see it, I guess, slightly differently. I think we all accept that there's some legitimacy, at least, to law enforcement talking to social media companies about crimes happening on social media sites, organized crime, terrorism, et cetera, being organized on the platform from like a national security, foreign policy standpoint. Now, obviously, the deep state went so awry on this and was so wrong about so many things. And, they're telling Twitter this is Russian origin, and Twitter saying, we're looking at this. We really don't think it is. And then eventually they're like, okay, if you say so. They're so clumsy and bad at it. But I think probably most people would accept there's some legitimate, like if ISIS has a Facebook group and then the CIA says, hey, we want you to take down this group, I would probably say, and probably most people would say, that's not necessarily nefarious for our government to do that. Compared to, now, on the other hand, I don't really think, I think what the CDC and then the White House and other health people did to social media, you can call it benign, but it falls, to my mind, way far further outside the scope of government, even from a public health standpoint, saying, like, there's, to my mind, national security and law enforcement and like prevention of crime is government's legitimacy, not like trying to control speech related to public health. So for me, it's almost the opposite.
I think that's a really good point, and especially because we know now that the facts around vaccines are so much more complicated than they wanted us to believe, and there really was an absence of public debate about that could have had an impact on some people's health, especially young men we know with myocarditis. So I take your point. That's a really, really interesting argument,
Yeah.
and we will have more rising right after this.